God bless the great state of New Hampshire. So what a victory last night. You know, 2 nights ago I was watching TV, watching the stations. On every station, every pundit said there's no way Cruz can win. Can't happen, it's impossible, the race is done. But last night, the men and women of Iowa sent notice across this country that this election is not going to be decided by the media. That this election is not going to be decided by the lobbyists and the Washington cartel. That it's going to be decided by the grassroots. It's going to be decided by the men and women here in this room. It's going to be decided by the men and women across this country who take so seriously their responsibility of vetting the candidates. You know, one of the things Heidi and I have grown to so love about New Hampshire, to so love about Iowa, is both states take your responsibilities seriously. Look, y'all treat politics in New Hampshire like we treat football in Texas. You understand that there are millions of Americans who are counting on each and every one of you to vet the candidates. Not to listen to the empty talk, not to listen to the campaign promises, but instead to look us in the eye and determine who's telling the truth and who's blowing smoke. That's what y'all are doing. And it is incredible, it is important, and there are Americans across this country who are counting on you to make that determination. Now, what we saw last night was we saw that old Reagan coalition coming back together again. We saw conservatives and evangelicals and libertarians and Reagan Democrats all standing together saying, what on earth are we doing? You know, there's a great little booklet. All I ever need to learn in life, I learned in kindergarten. They really ought to pass it out in Congress. You know, it's things like don't lie. And do what you say you're going to do. None of this is rocket science. How about we have candidates who, if they campaign saying, if you elect me, we'll repeal Obamacare, how about we have candidates who go to Washington and actually repeal Obamacare? If we have candidates who say, I'm opposed to amnesty, I want to secure the border. How about if we elect them, they go to Washington, and we actually stop amnesty and secure the border? How about if we get back to the Constitution? You know, you look at the Constitution, you look at the principles that built this country. And by the way, look, what the media wants to do is say something like the Constitution, well, that's a crazy right-wing document. Does that show how out of touch the national narrative is? Listen, what we are fighting for is basic common sense. In every small town, in every small business, and families for centuries in this country. Live within your means. Don't bankrupt our kids and grandkids. Follow the Constitution. That's common sense all across this country. It's what folks might even call New England common sense. And yet, to Washington, those are viewed as radical and extreme ideas. I mean, really, what's $19 trillion between friends? And you know, to really underscore it, I think back, 2012. 2012, I spoke at the Republican National Convention. And I talked about the national debt. I talked about our two little girls, Caroline and Catherine. And afterwards, I went back to the hotel room and began looking at Twitter. That was before Donald was tweeting about me every day. And began looking at Twitter, and it so happened that Paula Poundstone, the comedian, was watching that night. I guess she didn't have anything better to do. And she sent a tweet. She said, Ted Cruz just said, when his daughter was born, the national debt was $10 trillion. Now it's $16 trillion. What the heck did she do? Look, Heidi and I both laughed really, really hard, but our daughter Caroline, who is here somewhere, I don't know where she is, but she's here. Look, Caroline is 7. I want you to think about that. In her short life, the national debt has gone from $10 trillion to now, just last week, we crossed $19 trillion. In Caroline's life, what we are doing to our kids and grandkids, it is wrong, it is immoral. No generation in American history has ever done this to the next generation. And if we don't stop it, young people are going to spend their entire lives not working to meet the needs of the future, the priorities of the future, their priorities, but simply working to pay off the debts of their deadbeat parents and grandparents. You know, the media doesn't understand why people are so ticked off with Washington. But when you start mortgaging the future of our kids and grandkids, people have a way of getting fairly irritated about that. The reason we're here today is we want our country back. This is a movement from the people. It is a movement of people who are furious with Washington, D.C., with the Washington cartel, with career politicians in both parties who get in bed with lobbyists and special interests and grow and grow and grow government. Now, when was the last time we broke the Washington cartel? 1980. 36 years ago, and I'll tell you, the Granite State played a critical role in making that happen. You know, back in 1980, all the media said, this guy Reagan, he's a crazy right-wing kook, he's too extreme, and by the way, he's really down in the polls. That's what the media said over and over again. But you know what? Live free or die state took a look at Reagan and said, that guy believes what he's saying. He's not reading from talking points. He doesn't have a consultant who said, okay, go pretend you're for this. He's speaking from the heart. He means what he says. He tells the truth, and he's going to do exactly what he says. And the Granite State shocked this country by giving Reagan the victory, and it literally, the men and women of New Hampshire, changed the course of history of America and of the world. Your actions liberated billions from bondage. Won the Cold War, tore the Berlin Wall to the ground. That's what New Hampshire did. And Washington doesn't like that. What scares Washington is when the people stand up and assert the sovereignty of we the people. Too many politicians in Washington who think the people work for them. They get it exactly backwards. We work for you. And I want to tell you something amazing is happening across this country. People are waking up. There is an awakening sweeping this country. So I want to ask everyone here to look forward to January 2017. president, let me tell you what I intend to do on the first day in office. The first thing I intend to do is rescind every single illegal and unconstitutional executive action taken by The second thing I intend to do is instruct the U.S. Department of Justice to open an investigation into Planned Parenthood and to prosecute any of our federal officers. The third thing I intend to do is instruct the Department of Justice and the IRS and every other federal agency that the persecution of religious liberty ends today. The fourth thing I intend to do is rip to shreds this catastrophic Iranian nuclear deal. The fifth thing I intend to do on the first day in office is begin the process of moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, the once and eternal capital. Now that's day one. In the days that follow, I will go to Congress and we will repeal every word of Obamacare. We'll pass common sense health care reform that makes health insurance personal and portable and affordable and keeps government from getting in between us and our doctors. I will instruct the U.S. Department of Education that Common Core ends today. We will finally secure the borders and end sanctuary cities. We will rebuild our military. And we will honor our solemn commitments to every soldier and sailor and airman and Marine. That includes fundamentally reforming the VA so that every veteran can choose his or her doctor. And that includes protecting the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms of every serviceman and woman. We will have a commander-in-chief who stands up and says to the world, we will defeat radical Islamic terrorism. We'll have a president willing to utter the words, radical Islamic terrorism. And we will not weaken, we will not degrade, we will utterly and completely destroy ISIS. In the days that follow, we'll take on the EPA. And the CFPB. And the alphabet soup of federal agencies that have descended like locusts on farmers and ranchers and small businesses, killing jobs all across this country. And I will go to Congress, and we will pass fundamental tax reform, a simple flat tax where every American can fill out our taxes on a postcard. And when we do that, we should abolish the IRS. Now, some of y'all may be thinking, can it happen? Can we do it? You know, Scripture tells us there's nothing new under the sun. I think where we are today is very, very much like the late 1970s, like the Jimmy Carter administration. Same failed economic policies. Same feckless and naive foreign policies. In fact, the exact same countries, Russia and Iran, openly laughing at and mocking the President of the United States. Now, why is it that that analogy gives me so much hope and optimism? Because we remember how that story ended. All across this country, millions of men and women rose up and became the Reagan Revolution. And it didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. It began right here in New Hampshire in the live free or die state, and it changed this country. It changed the world. Why am I so optimistic? Because the same thing is happening again. It took Jimmy Carter to give us Ronald Reagan. And I am convinced the most long-lasting legacy of Barack Obama is going to be a new generation of leaders in the Republican Party who stand and fight for liberty, who stand and fight for the Constitution, who stand and fight for the Judeo-Christian values that built this great nation. And with that, I'm happy to answer or dodge any question you like. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I understand that you're a big supporter of President Reagan, and so I want to ask you if, like him, you would work to keep us secure by sitting down with the Russians to negotiate mutual reductions in nuclear weapons.
Well, thank you for that question. And listen, from my perspective, I'm happy to sit down and negotiate with practically anybody. But the key is how you negotiate with our enemies. And what we've seen over the last 7 years is an illustration that weakness and appeasement doesn't work. That coddling our enemies is a disastrous policy. I believe in Reagan's philosophy of peace through strength. The way to sit down with the Russians is to do it from a position of strength. So, for example, let me give you an example of the sort of thing we ought to be doing with Russia. Listen, Putin is not a complicated guy. Putin is essentially a KGB thug. And the only thing he respects is strength. Putin views Barack Obama as a laughingstock. Now, let's go back to when Russia invaded Ukraine. What should we have done? I'll tell you what I called on President Obama to do at the time. I said the first thing we should have done is immediately installed the anti-ballistic missile batteries in Poland and the Czech Republic that were scheduled to go into effect. Now, Obama and Hillary Clinton canceled those in 2009 in an effort to appease Putin. The appeasement obviously didn't work, and that would have been a powerful statement to our friends and allies, we stand with you. But the second thing we should have done is there were at the time 22 applications pending to export liquid natural gas. President Obama should have held a national TV conference and approved immediately all 22. Now that would have done three things. Number one, it would have helped the people of Europe, it would have helped the people of Ukraine stand free from Russia's blackmail. Listen, if you're leading Ukraine, and Russia is the leading provider of heating oil, y'all understand in New Hampshire Windham. If Putin had the ability to cut off your heat and cause your citizens potentially to freeze to death, that puts you in real vulnerability. Providing liquid natural gas from the United States helps Ukraine and Europe stand free from Russia's economic blackmail. Secondly, though, it hits Putin where it hurts, in the pocketbook. You know, John McCain has a great phrase for Russia. He says Russia is essentially a gas station with a country attached. Putin is a petro-tyrant. He uses their oil and gas to fuel their military aggression. Taking away their customers is a powerful blowback. But third, it would have created jobs and economic growth here at home. And it's only because of domestic politics that Obama was not willing to do any of that. What Reagan demonstrated is you can negotiate with the Russians from strength. When it comes to nuclear weapons, Reagan, and I like Reagan, would love to see a world where there were no nuclear weapons. If I could wave a magic wand and have every nuclear weapon go away, these are horrific tools of mass destruction. Every one of us would wave that wand if we could make them go away, but we can't. And I do think the very first obligation of the President and Commander-in-Chief is to keep us safe. The single greatest national security threat we face right now concerns nuclear weapons, but it's not, I don't believe, Russia's nuclear weapons. It is Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. So I would be happy to negotiate and work with the Russians as strategic competitors, not being fooled into thinking they're our friends, but where our interests align and we negotiate from strength, we can advance the ball a lot more than showing the weakness and appeasement that Obama has shown them for the last 7 years.
I love your plan as a former small businessman. I love your plan to do something about these oppressive regulations that anybody who's in business here has suffered with. I do want to ask you, though, will you be careful to be sure that disabled people in this country continue to be protected by the American for Disabilities Act?
Great question, and listen, absolutely yes. You know, you look at people with disabilities, and people with disabilities, like all Americans, want to be independent, want to work productively. You know, one of the real problems of a lot of federal government policy towards people with disabilities is far too often it moves towards stripping them of their independence. It moves towards sometimes institutionalizing them, preventing them from working. Listen, the vast majority of people with disabilities are capable of doing meaningful work. Now listen, some people may not be able to do heavy manual labor depending on the nature of the disability. But the vast majority of people with disabilities are able to work productively, to have the dignity of work. And I think that should be something we should strive for everyone to be able to work productively. And you know, I'll give an example. My former boss, Greg Abbott, when I was the Solicitor General of Texas, Greg Abbott was the Attorney General, he's now the Governor. And Greg Abbott is in a wheelchair. 30 years ago, when he had just taken the bar, he just graduated from law school, he'd taken the bar, he was out jogging, and lightning struck a tree. And the tree fell on him and broke his back. And he's been paralyzed from the waist down for the last 3 decades, he's been in a wheelchair. And you know, it's interesting, when I went to work for him back in 2003, you know, he jokes all the time about it. And one joke he tells, he says, "Okay, I know what you must be thinking. How slow was that guy running to get hit by a tree?" And I have to tell you, the first time or two he tells the joke, you're working for him, you're kind of awkward, you're not sure, am I allowed to laugh? I mean, what, you know, is it okay? But he is someone I admire so much because, yes, he has a disability. And it hasn't slowed him down one iota. When it comes to people with disabilities, I give you my commitment. I will do everything I can as president to expand their independence, to expand their ability to work meaningfully, to empower them to have access and the ability to work and provide for themselves, because I think that is a human dignity that every human being should be able and is entitled to be able to experience.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. One of my bigger concerns is the immigration, and Marco has thrown a lot of clouds of whatever on this so-called poison pill and path to citizenship. Can you just very briefly state exactly what, because I've researched and I just would like a clear picture on how he has slanted it and what you really stand for.
Well, I have to say I love your phrase, a lot of clouds of whatever. That actually, that is a very accurate and evocative phrase. Listen, on immigration, the lines in this race are actually very, very clear. Let's go back to 2013. And let me step back for a second. Let me suggest a rubric for all of us to use to assess candidates. You know, every one of us, we've been burned by candidates. People who promise something good, then they go to Washington, they don't do it. And the stakes are too high for that to happen again. And so I would suggest the test we ought to apply is the scriptural test. You shall know them by their fruits. That what I would recommend to each of you is don't listen to what any of us say. Don't listen to what I say. When's the last time you heard a politician say, don't listen to what I say? And don't listen to what anybody else says. Instead, check our fruits. Look to what we've done. Look to, if you say you believe these principles, have you walked the walk? And the moment that I believe was the time, the clarifying moment, it was what Reagan would call a time for choosing on immigration, was the 2013 battle over the Gang of Eight amnesty bill. Now, Marco, when he ran for Senate in Florida, promised the men and women of Florida, if you elect me, I will go to Washington and I will lead the battle against amnesty. He said that over and over and over again. It was a commitment he made to the voters. Me, when I ran in Texas, I promised the men and women of Texas, if you elect me, I will go to Congress and I will lead the fight against amnesty. We said virtually the identical things to the voters who elected us. But when we got to Washington, Marco and I took very, very different paths. Marco made the decision, the conscious, deliberate decision, not only not to lead the fight against amnesty, but to go and stand with Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid, and to lead the fight for amnesty. The Gang of Eight bill is the Rubio-Schumer bill. Marco Rubio and Chuck Schumer wrote it together. The bill failed to secure the borders. The bill expanded President Obama's ability to bring Syrian refugees to this country without mandating any meaningful background checks. And the bill provided that all 12 million people here illegally would have a pathway to U.S. citizenship. It was directly contrary to what Marco had promised the men and women who elected him. Now, there's a reason that he did that. You know, I make a lot of reference to the Washington cartel. The Washington cartel are those career politicians and lobbyists. It's all about money. The Washington cartel supports amnesty. It's because K Street and Wall Street views amnesty as cheap labor. Cheap labor is great. Drive down wages, that's fabulous from their perspective. And so when you support amnesty, have you noticed how the press praises those enlightened Republicans who support amnesty? And the donors, by and large, many of the donors support amnesty as well. But I made a very different decision. I chose instead to stand shoulder to shoulder with Senator Jeff Sessions and with Congressman Steve King and with millions of Americans and lead the fight against amnesty. I chose to honor the commitments, the promises that I made to the men and women of Texas. And I'll tell you the reason why. I wasn't willing to go back to Texas and stand in a town hall and look the people who elected me in the eyes and say, I broke my word to you. That mattered more to me than the adulation, than the money, than the praise from the media, from the donors, from the Washington cartel. I remembered who I was working for, which is the people who elected me to fight for them. And on that battle, that was an epic battle. It's worth remembering just how close it came to passing. The Rubio-Schumer amnesty bill passed the Senate. Got every single Democrat and a whole bunch of establishment Republicans. Then it was headed to the House. And John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, intended to take it up and pass it with all the Democrats and a handful of leadership and establishment Republicans. And if that had happened, this would have been over. The issue would have been lost. It would have been game over. It would have gone to Obama's desk, he would have signed it, and amnesty would have happened. That was a time for choosing. It was a moment where everyone decides where do you stand. And the reason it was defeated is Jeff Sessions and Steve King and I stood up and led the fight. We said this is wrong. This violates the rule of law. It's unfair to millions of legal immigrants. It's unfair to millions of working men and women who are losing their jobs, who are seeing their wages driven down. And millions of people across this country rose up against it. Now, one of the tactics of the Washington cartel is they like to blur the lines. Part of their defense is, everybody does it. That's what they try to convince you. You know what? Everyone's lying, everyone's untrustworthy, so you ought to go with me. Because I'm one of the liars too. I mean, that's their talking point. And so what Marco is trying to say, pushed by lots of folks in the media, is he's focusing on one amendment that I introduced. I'd encourage you, go to my website, tedcruz.org. Read the amendment I introduced. It's one sentence. It is 36 or 38 words. 38. 38 words. That's the power of an informed grassroots. My one-sentence amendment said, anyone here illegally can never become a U.S. citizen. Period.
There you go.
Didn't say a word about legalization. So here's what Marco's trying to say. Well, your amendment, you said no citizenship, so that means you support all the other garbage in the Gang of Eight. No, that thing was 1,000 pages long. The fact that I introduced one-sentence amendment to fix one problem in the bill does not mean you get to stick on me all of the rest of the garbage of the bill. Particularly when I was leading the fight to defeat the whole bill. And I'll point out also, so you want to know who to believe. One of the ways to know who to believe is to look to trusted third parties. Jeff Sessions, probably the leading opponent of amnesty in the U.S. Senate. Jeff Sessions came to an event for me in Alabama where he stood up responding to these Rubio attacks, and he said, listen, they're completely false. And what Senator Sessions said is, without Ted Cruz, the Gang of Eight amnesty bill would have passed. And because Ted stood up and fought and led, we defeated it. So that's Jeff Sessions' take. Steve King in the House, the leading opponent of amnesty, is one of my national co-chairmen of my campaign, has spent the last month campaigning all over Iowa, leading the fight against amnesty and saying, you know what, in every one of those fights, Ted was in the foxhole right next to me, and it was Marco in the foxhole with Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer shooting at us. And the media tries to tell you we were in the same foxhole. And I'll tell you beyond that, you can look to Mark Levin and Rush Limbaugh, who have both said this is real simple. And even forgetting about the Gang of Eight. And by the way, during the Gang of Eight, where was Donald Trump? You know, as a presidential candidate, he has discovered that illegal immigration is a good issue. If you really cared about illegal immigration,